Glad that you all could make it this evening for a premiere screening of it's going to be a quite interesting film series called Goliath that's done by Amazon. And what we're going to do for the order of the program is we're going to show the premiere of the first episode, and then we're going to hear some conversation with Elizabeth Ross, who is a guest from firm here in Boston, and from the actual producer, Jonathan Shapiro, and I'll say more in terms of introductions when we start the Q&A right after the film. So, without further ado, I am showing the film. So, Elizabeth Ross works with Krupkaitis and Blumstein here in Boston, mostly as a transactional and real estate attorney, and one of the reasons we thought was also invite a person who's in a smaller firm and what that's like in comparison to although we don't see as much too of the big firm in this premiere. And Jonathan Shapiro is the writer and producer of this show, working with David E. Kelly. I can see from some of the audience who may be too young to have known the practice, although everything's on YouTube. So you might, or I guess I can't say Netflix, since Amazon is the producer of this show. But I thought I would also just sort of, before we even sort of talk about the ideas in terms of big firm, small firm, but a little, both also to give Jonathan a little bit of what made you think of this idea for this particular show, and I know now to understand the Indiana reference, having talked with you for dinner. So,
thank you for having me. I was an undergraduate and graduate student here at Harvard, and I was kicked out of the law library in 1982 for talking. So it's a thrill to be back and to see no one is still angry about it. I was a federal prosecutor for 10 years, and in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, I handled, among other things, defense procurement fraud cases. So those would be people who would violate the law in terms of weapon systems and things. And I was a writer-producer on The Practice and Boston Legal and The Blacklist and Life and all these other shows. And I always wanted to do an episode about what I think is, if water is the most interesting part of Chinatown, the defense industry to me is the most interesting part of Southern California. We make the weapons that will one day destroy the world. And my grandfather was a steel worker in the Bethlehem Steel Plant in San Pedro, California, building Liberty ships during the war, and he died of asbestos poisoning 2 years later. And we don't build statues for the workers who died in these industries, and a lot of them do. And so that was sort of the basis for the story.
And Lisa, you also saw a little of the pilot before, even when you see the battle of, now small firm is maybe even a misnomer. This is a solo practitioner. So the idea
my life isn't exactly like that.
Yes, but the idea of going up against a bigger firm, when you see that portrayed on the screen, what does it raise for you?
Well, I'm not a litigator. I think maybe there's a little bit of truth in the sort of imbalance in the more in the litigation world, where things can get stretched out and there can be lots of staff assigned to a case. In the cases that I work on, often I'm working on transactions with bigger firms, and there's more staff on those on the other side. But it usually, the imbalance, we all kind of want to get the deal done, and so I think there's less sort of a feeling of David and Goliath. By the way, you gave a hint about what this is going to be about when you talked about
Well, how many people are here? I figure I could get a lot of.
We're supposed to find the show
anybody,
where
so.
it's like
Yeah.
why did that happen? Anyway, sorry.
Well, and also very good of you also to use the name of the film by saying a little bit of the David and Goliath, yes, in terms of large scale.
Well, actually, that's the other reason that we wrote the show is that I was at Kirkland and Ellis of Counsel up until 18 months ago. I was writing for the Blacklist and writing pilots, but was handling litigation on behalf of hedge funds that were suing movie studios for lying about their accounting. And I hadn't been in a law firm since I went into television 16 years ago. And the law had changed to such a degree, I was shocked. The idea that it's a paperless environment by itself was shocking. But the summer associates had science backgrounds, and none of them wanted to be litigators. When I graduated law school in 1990, we all wanted to be Atticus Finch. The people I worked with all want to be in corporate doing deals. And the number of jury trials in the United States has gone down 40 to 60% in the 7 major metropolitan areas. Less than 1% of all federal cases ever get to jury trial. And the New York Times just did a big series about how most of us, without knowing it, have given up our right to take disputes with business to a jury. So that's bad. Right? James Madison in the Federalist Papers said the most important check on the abuses of democracy and capitalism is the jury system and the lawyer class. Well, the lawyer class all wants to be corporate deal makers who get a piece of equity, and nobody goes to trial anymore. And just so I'm clear, because I know it's a Harvard Law School group of people and that you get all this, but it's bad. And that was the point of the show, we don't know who, by the end of the series, it's not entirely clear who David is and who Goliath is. It doesn't break the way you might expect. But the real question is, why is it so hard to get in front of a jury nowadays? And what does that say about our country?
It's interesting because I was in there was a conversation actually for if there one else, but we had the very good fortune of having Merrick Garland do a conversation with the Minnow, and he talked about just the reduction and talking about what his day is like, but it's so different now because of the reduction of, as you said, the number of trials. So it also reduces, too, the number of cases that are going up in terms of appeal and how that has changed. But it's interesting, yes, you've taken dramatic license, but the idea that it's also about, like, how do we get cases to go to trial?
And this case that you'll see play out here is based on a series of cases that occurred at the U.S. Attorney's Office when I was there. People say, well, did you take license? Well, yeah, we did. There's only one person who died here. In the case that I'm thinking of, 2 people died. And nobody went to prison. And I think fines of a few $1,000s were paid. And, in Southern California, where the city of Los Angeles during World War I went from World War II, went from less than 1 million people to close to 4 million people. That was because of the defense industry. But it's a fundamental question that I just don't hear being talked about, which is, what does it mean that these people make bombs to kill people? And we all have in our IRAs and in our investment accounts blood money from people who make bombs that mostly kill non-combatants in the last little bit. And of all the things I hear being talked about, we don't hear that. And that was one of the impetuses of the show as well.
To at least spark some of that kind of conversation. So now, I will also even throw it open a little bit. If there are people, since there is such a small group, if there are people who have questions, and we do have a microphone, although we don't have to use it, I think you all can stand up and ask questions if you want to. No questions?
See, if we did this at Berkeley, there'd be all kinds of questions.
There
would be questions, and there'd be protests, and there'd be anger, and
we've had protests here.
Yeah.
We've had protests here at Harvard. What did you think? Do you want to hear that
Sure.
question? What did you think?
Okay,
Really?
that's fine. This is apparently not a, there's no grade participation, so there wouldn't be,
Well, we're not doing the Socratic method.
Yeah,
This is
that's
the
right.
thing. No cold calling.
all right. All right.
Well, I'll tell you one thing.
I want to go home and watch the next episode. I mean,
Oh, good.
It draws you in, at least
Yeah.
for me. I mean,
Good. Well, that's good. That's great. You know, it's,
and I'm glad for the whole system now where you can binge watch. It's not like you have to wait for the next episode a whole week later.
well, I don't know how many law students are actually here. Okay.
I know.
So I was an adjunct professor at USC in Loyola for a number of years, and I enjoyed working with young lawyers. And I always ask young lawyers to just remember that the law license is actually supposed to be a passport for you to do whatever you want. And I love being a lawyer. I mean, I left TV just to spend half my time practicing law. But I had a simple rule, which is I would never do any job that I didn't think was worthwhile for the profession. And I continue to do political asylum cases and things like that.
So you kept your license.
And I did keep my license, but you know, we were talking at dinner. You know, I think being a lawyer is the greatest job you could ever have. I love it. The fact that I think one of my 3 kids will do it. My daughter has told me there's no way. But, makes me very proud.
but your son he's 11, did you tell?
He's 18.
Oh, okay.
18
All
or
right.
15. So, yeah.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Sorry.
So anyway, I think it's great.
Because I was going to say he can change his mind.
You can still let 18 change his mind. Let's see. What I did find fascinating too is also the characterization, and maybe that also it felt very California in this sense, in the representation of what is a big firm, which is particularly in terms of glass. And when you think of quote big firm New York City, you think old wood. And even doing the kind of big room presentation in,
So
you wouldn't necessarily see that,
Right.
which looked like a Steve Jobs
So if-
kind of presentation of a new product.
If you told me in 1990 that there would be over 20 law firms in the United States with revenue of over $1 billion, I would have been surprised.
Yeah, I think a lot of
There
us
are.
would have.
The fact that I've said in the newspaper that Kirkland and Ellis is in no way the model for Cooperman McBride. And a friend of mine who's a partner at Kirkland and Ellis was offended because he said, wait, this would be great for recruiting.
Really?
So I suppose because I was doing litigation involving hedge funds, where the clients, I think, have an expectation that bigness is
A sign of the success.
benefit. You know, the other thing is large law firms have guys like Jeff Rose from Amazon, who's a wonderful public relations professional, who craft image and presentation as carefully as we craft shows. The gulf between what I did as a lawyer and what I do now as a writer has gotten so narrow that I literally have sat and done a focus group testing of a pilot show in the same room where I did a mock jury trial 20 years earlier. So, you know, I don't know what that means for the country. I think our profession has become not just business, but a corporate business, where corporate partners get pieces of companies and then are supposed to comply with the laws in terms of giving them advice on what they can or shouldn't do. And that's bad. It's bad.
Do you see that, Liz, in terms of, do you see the distinct difference in terms of big firm versus now that you're in a smaller firm?
I worked in a big firm for the first 7 years that I was practicing. And yeah, I mean, being in a small firm, I mean, is there any big firm that's like this? Just it felt so evil to me and so sterile. Anyway, that's not. What's the word I'm looking for? It was more. It was sort of a monolith, kind of just an idea. Maybe it becomes more real. But anyway, that was kind of how I saw the firm in the show. Just in thinking, basically, I was asked to come here tonight to talk a little bit about practicing in a small firm. You can't make generalizations about big firms or small firms. I worked in 3 different small firms, 2 of them for a very short time, and the one that I've been with for many years now has about 20 lawyers. It's one thing that you hear about coming out of law school is it's good to go to a big firm to get training. And one thing I was thinking before coming here tonight is that you get training in a very specialized area. I was a real estate lawyer, and I was it was a niche. Then I came to a small firm, and somebody asked me to do something that wasn't within that narrow area, and I totally freaked out. I think in some ways, working in a small firm, more different kinds of things are thrown at you, and in a lot of ways you get to be more of a lawyer in kind of a fuller sense. I mean, I'm whatever.
You do have to sort of flex more muscles, because sometimes for your firm you have to be a little more nimble.
Absolutely.
There's also a bit of a class distinction that I don't think I fully appreciated until I got out to practice law. Coming from places like Harvard and Berkeley, the choice of going to a big firm is there. Most lawyers don't practice
in big firms.
Most lawyers in California, in fact, practice in law firms with less than 5 lawyers. In addition, the American Bar Association and the Betty Ford Clinic put out a study this year about the extraordinary amount of substance abuse and alcoholism among members of our profession. 30%, 40%, significantly higher than any other profession. In addition, lawyers are suffering mental disease and at a higher rate than ever before. And that's one of the other elements of this that we talked about. At Berkeley, it never occurred to any of us that any of us would ever be solo practitioners or that we would work with solo practitioners. It certainly never occurred to us that any of us would have substance abuse problems or become alcoholics, and yet 30% of us will. And have tremendous anxiety and unhappiness. And that's law in the 21st century, too. If someone invites me to come to Harvard Law School, I'm going to come, because this is the great, I think, guiding light of our profession. And one of the things we wanted to do with the show was to and we went to the American Bar Association, David Kelly and I, National Convention, and we had a panel on this issue. And I can't tell you the number of lawyers that came up to me who said, I know Billy McBride. In fact, I had 3 different lawyers who said, was it? And they named a person.
Wow.
Oh my God.
I said, no, not really. Wow.
But it spoke to them in a real sense that they knew somebody who was like that.
Well, it's funny. I said, I don't know the person. As a matter of fact, when I was a prosecutor, there was a wonderful man named Mort Boron, who has since passed away, who was, in many ways, he was sober, but he fought that issue for many years. He was very open about it. You talk about a solo practitioner. This was a guy who practiced out of his car. I mean, it's like the Lincoln lawyer, except it wasn't a Lincoln.
Yeah.
And, it's... I don't know that they talk about those kinds of people at Harvard Law School, but you know what? They're a huge part of the profession.
When I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn DA's office in the 80s, and that was the thing that, and I came out of Columbia, and when you don't necessarily think about the solo practitioner, but I'm also a generation before computers, literally people using carbon paper.
Right.
They'd have like 2 or 3 sheets of paper, they're writing their motions on their briefcase, and then walking, the carbon to to the arraignment part, giving the other to the bridgeman in the courtroom. And it's when you're thinking practice, you're coming out of schools like we've gone to, you keep thinking, this isn't how people practice law. Will say technology has advanced it to where, you can store motions and keep them in the computer, and now with laptops, and you will see particularly if you go to courthouses that are trying smaller criminal cases or smaller civil cases or housing court, you will see people who live and work through their computer all the time, because they are, particularly if they're solo practitioners, they're the ones producing the work. Now it's not carbon paper, but...
Well, Mort, I remember I had a case against Mort, and he did the whole trial.
I know what carbon paper is. I realize I said that. Okay.
Mort did a whole 2-week trial, and he only wrote one note. And at the end of the trial, I asked him what the note was, and he said it was the name of the defendant because he couldn't remember that. And
that's why you asked the woman keeps saying, "What's my son's name? What's my son's name?"
That was, that wasn't even Mort. I mean, do you know the Alex Kaczynski, famous Ninth Circuit judge? He was the chief of the Ninth Circuit. He's a very important figure in the United States jurisprudence. Here's what show business is. I called up Judge Kaczynski and I said, Judge, in episode 4 of this, we need someone to play a federal judge, and I've written the character as the Honorable Judge Alex Kaczynski, and I could cast someone to play him. Would you like to play Alex Kaczynski, since you are Alex Kaczynski? And he said, very thick Romanian accent, which I won't attempt to do, but he said, of course he'll do it. And he donated his money to the Screen Actors Guild, and he was fantastic. I mean, he did all the lines, he knew all the lines, he was picture perfect. We did 4 or 5 takes. It was perfect. And then, like every other actor I've ever worked with, he said, could I just change some of the lines?
Oh, no.
And
did not like your copy.
And I would tell you that was not surprising to me, because, I don't know if you know this, Jeffrey, the only Emmy I've actually ever won, I won for a short film I made with Sandra Day O'Connor called Fair and Free a few years ago, as part of a civics. It was actually funded by the Association of Women Judges, and to teach people what the judicial branch is supposed to do, because most people don't know. They don't cover this at Harvard Law School, but when you're in front of a jury, you realize the dearth of civics education we have in this country. Anyway, Sandra Day O'Connor arrived. She had a long speech to give, and she was perfect, the Thurgood Marshall thing. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, I would never change a word, but I don't think this sentence worked. Which was worse.
It was just
because we'd already done it. And so and months go by, and it's Sandra Day O'Connor, it's just a few years ago, and she came to Los Angeles. I went to see her, and she was giving a speech, and she took me aside and said,
She still remembered? Oh my gosh.
And was still unhappy.
Oh my God.
And I thought, wow, that is a great actress. That is a great actress.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
Bill O'Reilly.
Bill O'Reilly.
So for those in the audience, Liz and I are married, so I've known him for a long time. I met Jonathan a couple hours ago. And I'm a lawyer. So Jonathan, I saw all these ethical conundrums that the lawyers were tussling with. The ex-wife says, don't ask me that, because she doesn't want to communicate. There's the sexual relations with the client, although I'm sure he rationalizes that she wasn't a client until the morning after. You can see him thinking about whether he should have contact with that minor child, and the ethical conundrum. So you're a lawyer, and obviously, you practiced a lot. And I'm just interested in how you've thought about it, because it just jumped out at me.
Oh, I'm glad.
This could be a professional responsibility course.
Right.
Just that one.
If we don't get a second season, I'll repackage it and go do that. I guess what I was saying, thank you for that question, but I guess what I was saying before, this sort of makes me realize what I meant. The reason I love being a lawyer was When you're a young lawyer, it's a very hard-won competence, right? You're spending all your time trying to figure out, where am I supposed to stand? How do I get this evidence in? I don't know when to object. I can't really figure anything out. And it takes about, I was lucky because they sent me to the D.C. Superior Court to try cases. And so I had, 70 cases my first 2 years to juries. And after about 5 years, you actually get to a level where you have a court sense.
Yep.
You can sort of let the game come to you, and now you can start to be strategic. And now you're starting to see all the ethical issues because you're always looking at, as you know, you're looking at it from the other guy's point of view, right? Because you're trying to figure out what you can catch them doing. So, I've written 2 books about the law. Pretty much all the shows I've ever worked on are law shows. Law's my thing. I mean, I don't think there's any story. Moby Dick perhaps would work, but although his obsession, I've known a few lawyers, but Herndon in his book on Lincoln, Herndon was Lincoln's law partner. Herndon said the reason why Abe Lincoln was a great storyteller was because Abe Lincoln loved stories. And he didn't just love to tell them, he loved to hear them. And he would steal stories and change them. Well, that to me was every day of law. There was just, if stories happen to people who can tell them, I just thought, people coming in with problems. At a place like Kirkland and Ellis, the people coming in are rich and think they're smarter than anybody else. So there's a whole other level of satisfaction and enjoyment. And you're wrestling with these ethical issues that would make a Talmudic scholar's head blow up. And so I'm so glad you noticed that, because you kind of have to sort of be a lawyer to... The goal was to try to lay in as much of that. And as you'll see, he makes good decisions and he makes bad decisions. And that, to me, was the fun part of being a lawyer, is just you're constantly having to make those calls.
But also the thing with when you talk about storytelling and narrative, I mean, that was, when you say you finally have the cases come to you, the one thing that I do think that happens for a trial lawyer when you begin to understand whether you're prosecution or defense, here are a set of facts. It's like, what is the story that I have to, particularly if you have to convince a jury, what is the narrative that I need to tell? Not just about what are the facts I need to present. It's like, what's the narrative? And by about your 3rd year, you begin to understand this is the aspect of storytelling. And not that you have to be theatrical or dramatic, but it's also about still being able to tell a convincing story in a way that people will listen. And that's what I think is wonderful about seeing visually you writing a story about lawyers, because then you're thinking, what's a story that people are going to see or going to watch or going to want to keep looking at, even though you have the visual element, but you do have great dialogue, and those things that sort of make good story. So
there's an actual question. It's so exciting.
So we had to get them warmed up.
So how do you, I guess, the background is sort of, in the last few years, Suits has been like the legal show, and so for every non-lawyer you have friends asking you, is your life like that? And you're like, no, it's not at all like that. And so sort of, how have you, where's sort of the artistic license versus keeping it real? And how does that work for you, if nobody knows?
That's a great question. I'm not trying to sell my first book, but if you wanted to, I wrote a book called Lawyers, Liars, and the Art of Storytelling. And in that book, I talk about the fact that I once pitched a story when I was writing on The Practice, for William Shatner had just joined the show for his character. And the network said, we love the story, but we think it strains credulity. No one will believe it. So I brought in a trial transcript that showed that it was real. It happened. It happened in federal court on this day. Here's the transcript. And Peter Roth, the head of Warner Brothers Television, said something that had always stayed with me, which is, look, Shapiro, just because something happened doesn't mean it's true.
Oh, Lord have mercy. Okay.
So you asked, how do you take license? And because I only really practiced in federal court in front of federal judges, and Merrick Garland, God bless him, and the former dean here, God bless her, but 10 years in front of federal judges, with all due respect, I think they're crazy. I mean, the reason they don't let TV cameras into federal court is obvious to me. So, to be honest, like I said, the license we took was to reduce the number of people killed. Sometimes it's to make it more believable. Do I know lawyers who slept with clients? Yes. Do I know lawyers who slept with... Do I know situations where, not me, a prosecutor was sleeping with the defendant's lawyer during a criminal case? Yes. Do I know these ethical issues? Have I seen them happen in one way or another?
Others as secretaries.
So I'm glad you asked. Grant Cooper, who was a great LA lawyer, and was Sirhan Sirhan's lawyer.
Oh, whoa.
And was a DA in the 30s in Los Angeles. Hired a very interesting group of people who, and as happens here, it's not so much that he went out and hired somebody who was in an odd profession. It was he represented people who couldn't pay him. So then the question becomes, how do I get paid? Funny story about Grant Cooper. He was 6'4" and a real legend in the LA bar. And one day he's playing golf at the LA Country Club, and a little strange bearded man runs up to him and says, "You have an amazing face. Have you ever acted? Because I'm making a movie and I want to cast you in the role." And Grant Cooper said, "What's the role?" He'd never been an actor. He said, "Well, you're going to play a New York cop, and you're going to punch Al Pacino in the jaw and break his jaw." And Grant Cooper said, "Well, don't hire me, hire my client, who's been blacklisted for years because he named names in front of you, Sterling Hayden." And that's how Sterling Hayden got the part in The Godfather.
Oh my gosh.
And
you said that. I know exactly who that. Oh, wow.
And so if you read Sterling Hayden's memoir, he talks about his relationship with Grant Cooper. And you can't make that stuff up.
No.
I think if you're paying attention and you have a sense of humor, that's what makes being a lawyer great. I'll be honest. Here's what I was unhappy about as a lawyer. Not a lot of folks seem to embrace the humanity of it. I'm not talking about political positions. I'm just talking about the straight, unbelievably interesting human drama and comedy that occurs in a law office and in court. And because in my faith, law is sort of how we learn about humanity, it felt very comfortable for me. I expect that law will never be black and white. And it's, to me, both funny and tragic and human that the people in it are so flawed. And I won't babble, except one of the episodes I'm most proud of that David Kelly and I wrote was called The Court Supreme, because I was really upset, I'm still upset, that they don't let cameras in at the Supreme Court. So I said, what we'll do is we'll pick a case on the docket, and we'll cast actors to play the justices of the court, and we will take a real case, and we'll do the whole case based on the facts of a real case, and we'll air it the week before the actual case is argued in the Supreme Court.
Where can we see this?
It's called The Court Supreme. And what I found, the case I took was Kennedy versus Louisiana, which was the case involving Louisiana's effort to execute a man for child rape, but to execute someone who hadn't taken a life. And Alan Shore argues it, and Shatner's. The only reason Shatner's in court is because he's bet someone $10,000 that he can get Clarence Thomas to talk. But anyway, so that's an artistic license we took. But we did it straight, and we did it exactly based on the arguments. And First of all, who knew there were so many actresses in Hollywood who looked like Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I walked into a casting session and there were 12 Ruth Bader Ginsburgs. It was...
Her granddaughter's here at the law school.
Well, she should patent the look because there's a lot of... Anyway, and we predicted the outcome and the split, and we were right.
Okay, we're now going to download that from the practice. The Court Supreme will show it.
Yeah, 'cause and Tony Morrow and other people said really nice things. Fast forward, Kelly and I then, I think the last episode, or the second to last episode, we wrote an episode where Alan Shore and Denny Crane, so James Spader and William Shatner, decide for economic reasons it makes sense to get married. Right, so they get married. And they're at a hunting lodge, and they get Justice Scalia to conduct the wedding. So you cast the same guy the guy worked out so well as Scalia before. So apparently, Kelly tells the story that he's at some event, and Scalia's there. And Scalia says, I heard you wrote a show where yes, Mr. Justice. And two men marry, and I officiate? Kelly said, yes, Justice Scalia, that happens in the show, I'm afraid. And Scalia said, well, they were hunting at least.
Oh, God. It's great. Well, are there more questions?
Thank you all for coming.
I want to thank our guests. Thank you very much. Thank you for showing.
Thank
very
you.
much, Liz. That's good. Thanks for coming.